gaslighting us single people have to go through. Because let's be honest, a lot of the things that our friends in relationships can get for free, we have to pay for. And there's no amount of self-love or therapy that can kind of circumvent the frustration that being single is very expensive. Because if, an example, I am sick, I don't have anyone who can cook for me. My friend can ask her boyfriend to cook for her. I have to DoorDash something. If I need help moving something in my house, I need to go find someone and pay that person to come over and move it. Well, my friend can just ask her partner. And all those things just add up. If you lose your job, you have someone who can help you with rent. If you are having like financial trouble or health trouble, you now need to like disclose that to your family or friends, which might be embarrassing, or you can tell your one husband or your wife to help you through that. It is so frustrating to have to go through so many things alone and make these really big decisions, hard decisions completely by myself. I have my friends, I have my family, I love them, I can lean on them, but maybe I don't want to tell them all about my finances. Maybe I don't want to have to over-explain my entire health condition to them. Maybe I just need someone to help me with a real quick task that I don't want to have to pay someone or wait for someone to drive across town to come help me.
Society does not usually collapse with a loud crash. It frays quietly, one expectation at a time, until people wake up one morning and realize the rules they were promised no longer apply. What we are watching right now is not just an economic shift or a cultural argument. It is the slow unraveling of a social contract that people were told would protect them forever. And by the end of this video, you may see very clearly why so many people are panicking while others have already stepped away and found peace. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. Your support helps this channel grow and ensures these conversations continue. Also, check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. You can learn how to buy, sell, and trade crypto the right way. And the Academy is linked in the description of the video, so go check it out now while you are thinking about it. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is an easy way to support the channel and keep the content coming. Now let us talk about what is really happening. The cost of living is rising everywhere, and that pressure is revealing truths people were able to ignore when life was easier. Rent is higher, food is higher, transportation is higher, taxes are higher, stability is harder to reach. For decades, people were told that independence alone would solve everything, that community was optional, and that traditional structures were outdated. Those ideas sounded empowering when conditions were comfortable. They sound very different when survival becomes harder. What we are seeing now is a growing sense of anxiety playing out publicly. Social media is full of videos where people openly admit they are overwhelmed, burned out, and financially stressed. Some of these videos are framed as jokes, some are framed as venting, others are framed as demands for change. But beneath all of them is the same message. Life alone is harder than many expected, and the safety nets people assumed would always exist are thinner than advertised. At the same time, something else has happened quietly. A large number of men listened when they were told to step back, disengage, and stop participating in traditional dating and relationship dynamics. For years, men were told that their presence was not needed, that their effort was unwanted, and that silence was preferable to involvement. Many men took that message seriously. They stopped chasing approval. They stopped pursuing validation. They simplified their lives. And in doing so, many of them discovered something unexpected: peace. Being alone, it turns out, is not the same thing as being lonely. Solitude can be calm. It can be focused. It can be productive. When external expectations are removed, people often rediscover who they are without constant pressure. Many men began to invest their time into their health, their finances, their hobbies, and their sense of self. They downsized emotionally and materially. They learned to live with less noise and fewer obligations. And for many of them, that lifestyle felt sustainable. Meanwhile, cultural narratives continued to promise that independence without compromise was the highest form of success. Marriage rates continued to fall. Birth rates dropped to historic lows. Fewer people formed long term families. More people delayed or rejected parenthood entirely. Pets increasingly filled emotional roles that children once did. People spoke openly about their animals as family members, companions, and dependents in every sense except the legal one. That is where the story takes a turn that would have sounded absurd not long ago. Recently, a woman made headlines by suing the tax authority in an attempt to claim her dog as a dependent. This was not satire. It was not a parody. It was a real legal action grounded in a sense of financial strain and perceived unfairness. Families with children receive certain tax benefits designed to offset the cost of raising the next generation. Those benefits exist because children are expensive and because society depends on future contributors. But for someone without children, watching those benefits from the outside can feel frustrating, especially when money is tight. This case was not really about a dog. It was about resentment, pressure, and a sense of exclusion. It was about someone looking at the system and feeling locked out of relief that others receive. It was about someone trying to stretch definitions in a system that does not bend easily. And it was a powerful symbol of how strained things have become. Years ago, the idea of claiming a pet as a tax dependent would have been dismissed immediately. Today, it sparks debates, commentary, and sympathetic reactions from people who feel similarly squeezed. That alone tells you how much has changed. When financial stress pushes people toward legal gray areas and symbolic protests, it is a sign that something deeper is broken. The deeper issue is not gender, pets, or taxes. The deeper issue is expectations colliding with reality. For decades, many people were encouraged to believe that traditional partnerships were optional burdens rather than stabilizing forces. They were told that community was interchangeable, that support could be outsourced, and that independence meant never needing anyone. But human beings are not designed to live in isolation indefinitely. Economic systems especially assume cooperation, shared responsibility, and long term planning. When those systems meet widespread individualism, cracks appear. Men who stepped away did not disappear. They did not collapse. They adapted. They reduced their exposure to risk. They stopped investing resources where returns were uncertain or negative. They learned to live within their means and prioritize peace over approval. From their perspective, stepping back was not punishment, it was self preservation. At the same time, many women who embraced independence are now confronting the full cost of maintaining it alone in a harsher economic climate. That does not mean independence was a mistake. It means independence has a price that was often downplayed. When costs rise faster than income, people naturally look for relief. When relief appears unevenly distributed, frustration grows. Social media amplifies that frustration. Short videos capture emotional moments without context. Trends form around shared stress. Narratives harden quickly. Some people frame the situation as betrayal. Others frame it as injustice. Still others frame it as proof that the system needs to change. What is clear is that anxiety is no longer private. It is public, visible, and constant. What makes this moment especially tense is that the two groups experiencing these pressures are responding very differently. Many men have already adjusted their expectations downward. They are not seeking permission or validation. They are not trying to renegotiate old arrangements. They have accepted a quieter life and structured it around personal stability. That makes them difficult to pull back into systems they intentionally left. Meanwhile, many women are discovering that financial independence without structural support is more fragile than expected. When shared expenses disappear, when dual incomes are gone, and when long term planning becomes a solo responsibility, the margin for error shrinks. That reality is hitting at the same time as inflation, housing shortages, and economic uncertainty. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observable pattern. When people feel pressure, they search for solutions. Some look inward and simplify. Others look outward and demand accommodation. Some try to reinterpret existing systems to include them. That is how you end up with court cases that challenge definitions and test boundaries. It is not because people are irrational, it is because they are stressed. But stress does not rebuild trust. Trust erodes when people feel unheard. And for many men, trust eroded years ago. They were told to disengage and they did. They were told silence was safer than participation and they listened. Now that absence is being felt, but absence cannot be reversed on demand. Once someone reorganizes their life around peace, chaos becomes unattractive. The result is a growing disconnect. One side is asking for reintegration. The other side sees no incentive to return. That tension is not easily resolved because it is rooted in lived experience, not slogans. This moment reveals a truth that many did not want to acknowledge. Systems built on cooperation require mutual respect and shared responsibility. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. When either side feels exploited, cooperation collapses. And when cooperation collapses, people retreat into whatever stability they can create for themselves. What happens next depends on whether society chooses honest reflection or doubles down on blame. Blame is easy. It feels satisfying. It goes viral. Reflection is harder. It requires admitting that certain narratives were incomplete and that independence and community are not opposites, but balancing forces. And we are not watching a battle between people. We are watching a correction. Corrections are uncomfortable. They expose assumptions. They force adaptation, and they do not care about feelings. What makes this moment especially revealing is how quickly reality strips away comforting theories. When times are good, people can afford beliefs that sound empowering but are structurally weak. When times get harder, those beliefs are tested, and whatever cannot support real life pressure begins to crumble. That is exactly what we are witnessing now. The narratives that promised endless independence without cost are colliding with rising expenses, shrinking safety nets, and the emotional weight of going it alone. For a long time, many people believed that modern systems would replace older forms of stability. They believed careers would replace families, that the state would replace community, and that convenience would replace cooperation. Those ideas were not born out of malice. They were born out of optimism and comfort. But systems built during periods of abundance often fail when scarcity returns. When pressure increases, the question is no longer what feels fair, but what actually works. Men walking away was not a coordinated movement with leaders and meetings. It was a quiet pattern that emerged organically. One man stepped back, then another, then another. Each did so for personal reasons, but the outcomes were similar: less stress, fewer obligations, lower financial risk, more control over time. What began as self-protection slowly became a lifestyle choice. And once a person restructures their life around peace, it becomes very difficult to convince them to return to environments that previously drained them. This is why appeals based on guilt or nostalgia fall flat. You cannot guilt someone into chaos once they have tasted calm. You cannot shame someone into sacrifice once they have learned that sacrifice is optional. The old leverage points stopped working because the incentives disappeared. At the same time, the economic model continued to assume shared responsibility. Housing costs assume dual incomes. Childcare costs assume cooperative households. Even basic survival assumes some form of partnership or shared load. When those assumptions no longer match reality, individuals feel crushed. The system was not designed for everyone to carry everything alone indefinitely. This is where frustration begins to surface publicly. When people realize the system is not built for solo survival at scale, they begin searching for adjustments. Some demand policy changes, some demand social changes, some attempt to reinterpret existing rules, and some simply vent, hoping someone else will fix it. The lawsuit involving a pet being claimed as a dependent is symbolic because it reveals that sense of exclusion. It is not about animals, it is about access. It is about watching others receive relief while feeling locked out of it. When people feel excluded from benefits, they look for ways to qualify, even if those ways stretch common sense. That impulse grows stronger when people feel they played by the rules they were given and still ended up struggling. The irony is that many of the same voices now asking for expanded support once rejected and the very structures that make support sustainable. Families, long term partnerships, and shared responsibility were framed as restrictive or unnecessary. Now, as the costs of independence rise, those same structures are being re examined, not with affection, but with urgency. Urgency changes tone. It replaces confidence with bargaining. It replaces certainty with questions. And it reveals whether people truly believed what they said or whether those beliefs only held up under ideal conditions. That men who walked away did not do so to punish anyone, they did it to preserve themselves. That distinction matters. When motivation is preservation rather than revenge, there is no emotional hook to pull them back. They are not waiting for apologies. They are not seeking validation. They are simply living their lives with fewer liabilities. This creates a power imbalance that did not exist before. Traditionally, men were expected to pursue, provide, and endure instability in exchange for connection. When they stop doing that, the entire dynamic shifts. Suddenly, attention becomes scarce, resources become guarded, time becomes valuable, and expectations that once felt automatic now feel unrealistic. This shift exposes how much of modern dating and social interaction relied on unspoken obligations rather than mutual benefit. When those obligations disappear, people are forced to confront whether the exchange was ever balanced. That realization can be uncomfortable, especially for those who assumed the system would always favor them. The emotional response to that discomfort varies. Some respond with reflection, others respond with anger. Some seek compromise, others seek enforcement. The louder responses tend to dominate social media, but they do not necessarily represent the most effective adaptations. What is quietly happening beneath the noise is a sorting process. People who can adapt to independence are doing so. People who cannot are searching for alternatives. The tension arises when those alternatives require the participation of people who have already opted out. You cannot rebuild cooperation by pretending nothing happened. Trust does not reset automatically. When someone feels targeted, dismissed, or expendable, they become cautious. They look for patterns rather than promises. They prioritize observable behavior over words. And that makes reconciliation difficult without genuine structural change. Another layer to this situation is the generational impact. Younger people are watching all of this unfold in real time. They are observing the outcomes of different life choices without the filter of theory. They see who is stressed and who is stable. They see who is scrambling and who is calm. And those observations shape their decisions far more than slogans ever could. When younger men see older men living quietly, financially stable, and emotionally unburdened, that path becomes attractive. When younger women see peers struggling under rising costs without support, fear enters the equation. Fear accelerates decision making. It shortens timelines. It forces people to confront realities they hope to avoid. This is why conversations around birth rates, relationships, and long term planning have intensified. These are not abstract debates anymore. They are survival questions, and survival questions strip away performative language very quickly. The modern world encouraged people to believe they could customize life without trade offs. That belief is collapsing. Every choice has trade offs. Independence trades support for autonomy. Partnership trades autonomy for stability. There is no perfect option. There are only different costs. Men who walked away accepted the cost of solitude in exchange for peace. Many women who pursued independence are now confronting the cost of self reliance in a harsher economy. Neither path is inherently wrong, but pretending one has no downside creates false expectations that reality eventually corrects. What makes this correction painful is how unevenly it hits. People who adapted early feel insulated. People who delayed adaptation feel blindsided. And because social narratives lag behind reality, many are still operating under outdated assumptions. Another factor fueling frustration is visibility. Social media shows curated snapshots of success and struggle without context. Someone posting about peace rarely explains the sacrifices behind it. Someone posting about stress rarely explains the decisions that led there. Viewers fill in the gaps with assumptions, often inaccurate ones. This fuels resentment. Resentment thrives on partial information. It grows when people compare outcomes without comparing inputs. That dynamic makes productive conversation harder and emotional reactions louder. Yet beneath all of this noise, one truth remains consistent. Systems that rely on cooperation cannot function when trust collapses, and trust cannot be restored through demands. It can only be rebuilt through accountability, mutual respect, and aligned incentives. The challenge society faces now is whether it can recalibrate without coercion. Coercion breeds resistance. Resistance deepens division. Division accelerates withdrawal. And withdrawal leads to further instability. Men walking away was not caused by one event, it was the accumulation of experiences over time. Disrespect compounds, risk compounds, stress compounds. Eventually, people reach a threshold where disengagement feels rational. Once that threshold is crossed at scale, reversing it requires more than words. It requires tangible change. It requires acknowledging mistakes without defensiveness. It requires rebuilding trust brick by brick rather than demanding instant reconciliation. The attempt to claim a pet as a dependent is not the beginning of collapse. It is a symptom. It signals that people feel the system no longer reflects their reality. When systems feel misaligned, legitimacy erodes. And when legitimacy erodes, compliance becomes conditional. History shows that societies survive not by denying these moments, but by adapting honestly. That adaptation is rarely comfortable. It requires admitting that some ideas were incomplete. It requires letting go of narratives that no longer serve reality. And it requires recognizing that cooperation cannot be forced. It must be chosen. As costs continue to rise, more people will be forced to make hard decisions. Some will simplify, some will retreat, some will renegotiate, and some will double down on demands. The outcomes will vary accordingly. What is clear is that the era of effortless independence is over. Stability now requires intentional design. Peace requires boundaries, and cooperation requires fairness. Men who walked away found peace because they reduced complexity. They reduced exposure to risk. They reduced obligations that did not benefit them. That lesson is not gendered, it is structural. Anyone can apply it. But applying it means letting go of fantasies about endless support without responsibility. The future will belong to those who adapt without resentment, those who can accept trade offs without blaming others, those who can build lives that reflect reality rather than ideology. One of the most difficult truths for people to accept is that large social shifts rarely announce themselves clearly at the moment they begin. They reveal themselves slowly through patterns that are easy to dismiss until they become impossible to ignore. What we are seeing now is not a sudden crisis. It is the delayed result of choices layered on top of one another for decades. Choices that reshaped expectations while quietly weakening the structures that once absorbed pressure. When people were told they could have everything without compromise, few stopped to ask what would happen if conditions changed. When costs were low and opportunity felt endless, it was easy to believe that old systems were unnecessary. But systems are not built for ideal conditions. They exist for stress. They exist for downturns. They exist for moments like this. As pressure increases, the difference between those who prepared and those who assumed becomes stark. People who simplified their lives earlier now find themselves less exposed. People who relied on external validation or institutional promises feel trapped when those promises fail to materialize. That gap creates resentment, but resentment does not close gaps, it only widens them. Men who stepped away did not do so because they hated society. They did it because participation became increasingly risky with diminishing returns. Emotional investment carried reputational risk. Financial investment carried legal risk. Time investment carried opportunity cost. When people assess risk and decide the cost is too high, withdrawal is a rational response. What makes withdrawal powerful is that it does not require confrontation. It does not require explanation. It simply removes energy from a system that depended on it. Over time, the absence becomes noticeable. Systems that assumed constant input begin to strain. This is why many reactions now sound desperate rather than confident. Confidence assumes leverage. Desperation reveals its absence. When appeals shift from empowerment to pleading, it signals a reversal of power dynamics that few were prepared for. The public conversation often frames this as a moral failing rather than a structural one. That framing is comforting because it avoids accountability. It allows people to blame individuals rather than interrogate incentives. But incentives shape behavior far more reliably than morality ever will. If you create an environment where engagement is punished and disengagement is rewarded, you will get disengagement. That is not bitterness, that is pattern recognition. Humans, like all living systems, adapt to feedback. The men who walked away received consistent feedback that their presence was unnecessary or unwanted. They adjusted accordingly. Now that their absence creates strain, some want to reverse the message without addressing the feedback loop that caused it. That approach fails because it treats symptoms rather than causes. Another uncomfortable truth is that many social benefits were never designed to be universal. They were designed to encourage specific behaviors that supported long term stability. Tax benefits for families exist to offset the cost of raising future contributors. Shared housing norms exist because cooperation lowers risk. These incentives are not punishments for independence, they are acknowledgments of cost. When people reject the behaviors those incentives support, they also reject the benefits attached to them. Trying to claim those benefits without accepting the responsibilities creates friction. That friction is now visible in legal challenges, public debates, and cultural arguments. The attempt to redefine dependence reflects this friction. It is not about animals. It is about feeling excluded from relief during hardship. But exclusion is not always injustice. Sometimes it is alignment. Systems reward alignment because alignment sustains them. This does not mean people deserve to suffer. It means expectations need to match reality. When expectations drift too far from structural limits, disappointment becomes inevitable. Another layer complicating this moment is how quickly narratives harden once pressure mounts. Social media accelerates polarization. Short clips reward emotional extremes rather than nuance. People perform outrage because outrage travels. But outrage does not build solutions, it only amplifies tension. Quiet adaptation rarely goes viral. Peace does not trend. Stability is boring, but boring is often sustainable. The men who found peace did so by opting out of performative cycles. They stopped reacting, they stopped explaining, they stopped negotiating their worth. That withdrawal removed them from the feedback loop entirely. For those still inside the loop, watching others exit can feel like abandonment. But from the outside, it feels like survival. Perspective depends on position. The real danger now is not disagreement, it is misalignment between systems and reality. When too many people operate outside the assumptions those systems rely on, instability grows. Housing markets strain. Social programs face pressure. Cultural norms fracture. Historically, societies respond to this in one of two ways. They either adapt incentives to reality or they attempt to force behavior through pressure and shame. The latter rarely ends well. Forced participation breeds resentment. Resentment accelerates disengagement. Adaptation, on the other hand, requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that some ideas failed under stress. It requires revisiting assumptions about human behavior. And it requires designing systems that align incentives with sustainable outcomes. This is where conversations often stall. Honesty threatens identities built on certainty. Admitting miscalculation feels like defeat, but clinging to failing narratives is more damaging than admitting error. Systems do not care about pride. They respond only to inputs and outcomes. Men walking away is an outcome. Rising public anxiety is an outcome. Legal challenges over definitions are outcomes. These are not isolated events, they are connected signals pointing toward misalignment. Another signal is the shift in how people talk about time. More people are exhausted. Burnout is normalized. Rest is reframed as resistance. These are coping mechanisms for systems that demand constant output without sufficient return. Men who step back reclaim time by reducing obligations. That time became theirs. It allowed reflection, rest, and recalibration. Once time is reclaimed, giving it away becomes a conscious choice rather than an expectation. That changes everything. And time scarcity fuels desperation. When people feel trapped in cycles that consume time without progress, frustration grows. That frustration seeks targets. Often, it targets those who appear to have escaped the cycle. This dynamic explains much of the resentment aimed at people who opted out. It is easier to accuse them of selfishness than to confront the system that made withdrawal appealing. But withdrawal does not happen in healthy systems. It happens when participation feels unsafe or unrewarding. If society wants people to re engage, it must make engagement rational again. That means reducing risk. That means restoring trust. That means valuing contribution rather than punishing it. And that means accepting that cooperation must benefit all parties, not just one. The future will not be shaped by slogans, it will be shaped by incentives. People will move toward environments where effort produces stability. They will avoid environments where effort produces stress without security. This applies to relationships, careers, and communities alike. The principles are the same. Remove unnecessary risk. Align rewards with contribution. Respect boundaries. As economic pressure continues, more people will simplify. Minimalism is not a trend, it is a response to overload. When life becomes too complex to manage, people reduce variables. That reduction can look like withdrawal, but it is often strategic. Men walking away reduced variables, fewer expectations, fewer financial obligations, fewer social risks. That clarity created peace. Peace is addictive because it is rare. Trying to lure people back into complexity without offering comparable peace is unlikely to succeed. You cannot sell chaos as connection when someone has experienced calm. This does not mean society is doomed. It means recalibration is necessary. Systems must adapt to the reality of modern behavior rather than clinging to outdated assumptions. That adaptation may involve new forms of cooperation. It may involve revised incentives. It may involve cultural shifts that value mutual respect over entitlement. What it cannot involve is denial. Denial prolongs instability. Honest assessment shortens it. The lawsuit over a pet dependent will not succeed because it conflicts with structural definitions, but its significance lies in what it reveals. It reveals strain, it reveals desperation, it reveals a disconnect between expectations and systems. Ignoring that message would be a mistake. The path forward requires recognizing that independence and interdependence are not enemies. They are complementary when balanced correctly. Autonomy without support collapses under stress. Support without responsibility breeds resentment. Men who walked away chose autonomy because support felt conditional and responsibility felt one sided. If society wants to restore balance, it must address that asymmetry. This is not about returning to old roles, it is about creating fair ones. Roles that respect boundaries, roles that distribute risk, roles that reward contribution without exploitation. Until that happens, withdrawal will continue. Peace will remain attractive, and those who adapted early will remain insulated from the panic spreading through systems built on assumptions that no longer hold. As we move forward in this discussion, the focus will shift toward what comes next. Not blame, not nostalgia, but realistic paths that acknowledge human behavior as it is, rather than as ideology wishes it to be. The future will belong to those who see patterns clearly and adjust accordingly. Those who refuse to romanticize systems that failed them. Those who prioritize stability over applause. As pressure continues to rise, one of the most revealing changes is how people are redefining success. For a long time, success was presented as accumulation, visibility, and constant upward motion. Bigger homes, busier schedules, louder social lives, and endless ambition were framed as proof of fulfillment. That version of success depended heavily on external validation and constant participation. When participation becomes exhausting or risky, that definition collapses. Men who walked away quietly rewrote the definition. Success became stability. It became predictable expenses. It became calm mornings and uninterrupted evenings. It became having control over time rather than being owned by it. This shift did not require permission, and that is what made it powerful. It happened outside public debate, outside cultural approval, and outside institutional endorsement. The absence of noise often goes unnoticed until it is widespread. When enough people stop playing a game, the game starts to feel empty. That emptiness is now being felt in dating markets, in social spaces, and in economic assumptions. Systems built on constant engagement struggle when engagement drops. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is that it is not driven by hostility. It is driven by calculation. People are weighing inputs against outputs more carefully than before. Emotional labor, financial contribution, and time investment are no longer given automatically. They are evaluated. When evaluation replaces obligation, dynamics change. This evaluation mindset is spreading beyond relationships. It affects careers, friendships, and institutions. People are asking harder questions. Is this worth it? What do I gain? What do I risk? What happens if I walk away? Those questions used to be discouraged. Now they are unavoidable. Economic strain accelerates this process. When money is tight, tolerance for inefficiency drops. People stop subsidizing systems that drain them. They stop funding dynamics that feel unfair. They stop pretending that effort alone guarantees reward. Reality becomes the metric. This is why emotional appeals are losing effectiveness. Emotion does not pay bills. Emotion does not reduce risk. Emotion does not create stability. When people are under pressure, they prioritize tangible outcomes. They choose what works. The frustration visible online reflects a mismatch between emotional narratives and material conditions. Many narratives promise fulfillment through independence without acknowledging cost. Others promise safety through institutions without acknowledging limits. When those promises fall short, trust erodes. Trust, once lost, is difficult to rebuild because it requires consistency over time. It cannot be restored through declarations or campaigns. It is rebuilt slowly through aligned behavior. That process is slow and unglamorous, which makes it unpopular in a culture accustomed to instant feedback. Men who stepped away rebuilt trust with themselves first. They learned that their instincts mattered. They learned that saying no reduced stress. They learned that boundaries protected energy. Once internal trust is restored, external manipulation loses power. This internal recalibration is one of the most overlooked aspects of the shift. People often assume withdrawal is passive. In reality, it is active. It involves deliberate choices, habit changes, and mindset shifts. It requires discipline. It requires resisting social pressure, and it requires accepting that approval is optional. That acceptance changes how people respond to criticism. When approval no longer matters, shame loses its leverage. When shame loses leverage, control mechanisms weaken. This is why attempts to pressure disengaged individuals often fail. The tools no longer work. At the same time, those still operating within older frameworks experience growing anxiety. They sense instability but lack alternatives. They were told that certain paths guaranteed security. When those guarantees fail, confusion follows. Confusion often turns into anger. Anger seeks targets. It looks for people to blame. Often it targets those who appear calm while others struggle. Calm becomes suspicious. Peace becomes selfish. Withdrawal becomes betrayal. These accusations are emotional responses to perceived imbalance. But imbalance is not always caused by malice. Often it is caused by adaptation. Some adapt earlier, some adapt later. Early adaptation looks unfair to those who delayed. But timing is not morality, it is strategy. Another factor intensifying this divide is how differently men and women experience economic pressure. While both face rising costs, expectations shape impact. Men who withdrew often reduced expenses by simplifying lifestyles. Smaller living spaces, fewer social obligations, lower discretionary spending. This made rising costs manageable. Many women, encouraged to maintain certain standards of living and self presentation, face higher baseline expenses. Housing choices, social expectations, and consumption patterns create different pressure points. When income does not scale with these costs, stress accumulates faster. This difference is rarely discussed honestly because it challenges popular narratives. But ignoring it does not make it disappear. It simply pushes frustration into public spaces where it manifests as complaints, demands, and symbolic gestures. The attempt to expand definitions within tax systems reflects this pressure. It is an effort to align benefits with lived reality. But systems are slow to change, and definitions exist for structural reasons. When individual reality diverges from system design, friction is inevitable. That friction can be resolved in one of two ways. Either systems adapt to new realities or individuals adapt to existing systems. Historically, adaptation works best when both sides move toward balance rather than extremes. What balance looks like now is unclear, but some principles remain constant. Shared responsibility must be shared genuinely. Risk must be distributed fairly. Contribution must be valued without exploitation. And participation must be voluntary rather than coerced. Coercion may increase compliance temporarily, but it destroys trust long term. People comply out of fear, not loyalty. When fear fades or alternatives emerge, compliance evaporates. Voluntary cooperation, by contrast, is resilient because it aligns incentives. Men walking away demonstrated that alternatives exist. Even imperfect alternatives can be preferable to systems perceived as hostile. That realization spreads quickly. Once observed, the ripple effects extend beyond relationships. Housing markets adjust when household formation declines. Consumer behavior shifts when spending priorities change. Social norms evolve when participation drops. These changes compound over time. One of the most significant shifts is the revaluation of solitude. Solitude was once framed as failure. Now it is framed as refuge. That reframing changes everything. When solitude is acceptable, pressure to conform weakens. When pressure weakens, systems relying on conformity must adapt. This does not mean isolation is ideal for everyone. It means the stigma has lifted. People can choose solitude without shame. That choice alone alters bargaining power in social dynamics. The fear many express is not that people are alone, it is that they are choosing to be. Choice implies agency. Agency disrupts control. Control is often disguised as concern. Appeals are framed as care. Demands are framed as fairness. But when people sense manipulation, they resist. Resistance grows when patterns repeat. The repeated messaging that men must re-engage for the good of society fails because it ignores why disengagement occurred. Appeals that skip accountability do not resonate. They feel hollow. Accountability requires acknowledging that certain behaviors drove people away. It requires acknowledging that risk was not evenly distributed. It requires acknowledging that some voices were dismissed for too long. Without that acknowledgement, calls for unity sound like attempts to restore imbalance rather than correct it. This moment forces a reckoning with assumptions about gender roles, economic structures, and personal responsibility. Reckonings are uncomfortable. They challenge identity. They threaten narratives, but they are necessary for progress. Progress does not mean reverting to the past. It means building something more stable from lessons learned. That stability must be grounded in reality rather than ideology. The rise of minimalist living among men is one such lesson. It shows that happiness does not require excess. It shows that peace can be cultivated intentionally. It shows that fewer obligations can lead to greater freedom. These lessons are transferable. Anyone can simplify, anyone can reduce risk, anyone can prioritize peace. But doing so may require letting go of expectations imposed by others. Letting go is difficult. It feels like loss, but sometimes loss creates space for something better. Space is undervalued in a culture obsessed with accumulation. As systems strain, those with space adapt more easily. Those overloaded struggle. This is not judgment, it is mechanics. The future will reward flexibility, it will reward realism. It will reward those who observe patterns rather than cling to promises. Those who can adjust without bitterness will fare best. Bitterness traps people in the past. It keeps them focused on what should have been rather than what is. Adaptation requires facing what is without denial. The conversations unfolding now are part of that adaptation. They are messy, emotional, and often misdirected, but beneath them lies a simple truth. Systems must work for the people within them, or people will leave. Men left. Others are considering it. That is the signal. Ignoring signals does not stop collapse, it accelerates it. Responding to signals with honesty can stabilize systems before they fail completely. The question is not whether change is coming, it is whether it will be intentional or chaotic. Intentional change requires humility. Chaotic change requires none. As pressure continues, humility will determine outcomes. Those willing to admit misalignment can rebuild trust. Those who refuse will face further withdrawal. This is not about winners and losers. It is about alignment and sustainability. Systems that align survive. Those that do not fracture. As we move closer to the end of this discussion, the focus will narrow further on what sustainable alignment looks like going forward. Not fantasies, not nostalgia, but workable paths grounded in human behavior as it exists today. The noise will continue, but beneath it, patterns are already clear. And those who see them early will navigate the future with far less fear. As the landscape continues to shift, another pattern becomes increasingly clear. The people who are struggling the most are not necessarily those with the least resources. They are often the ones whose expectations were built on promises that no longer exist. When expectation and reality drift apart, frustration fills the gap. That frustration is not always logical, but it is predictable. For years, many people were encouraged to believe that social systems would adapt automatically to individual desires. The idea was that if enough people wanted something, institutions would bend to accommodate it. That belief worked when pressure was low and resources were plentiful. Under strain, however, systems revert to fundamentals. They prioritize sustainability over sentiment. They reward behaviors that reduce long-term risk. This is why the conversation feels harsher now. There is less room for emotional framing and more emphasis on outcomes. When resources tighten, systems become less flexible, not more. That rigidity feels cruel to those who expected constant accommodation, but it is simply how structures behave under stress. Men who walked away anticipated this rigidity, whether consciously or instinctively. By reducing dependence on external systems, they insulated themselves from institutional shifts. Fewer obligations meant fewer points of failure. This insulation did not make them immune to hardship, but it gave them options. Options are the currency of stability. Many people confuse options with privilege. They assume those who have options were handed them unfairly. In reality, options are often built through restraint. They come from saying no early rather than being forced to later. They come from limiting exposure rather than expanding it endlessly. That discipline is rarely celebrated, but it pays dividends under pressure. As economic strain increases, more people are realizing that their lives are over-leveraged. Over-leveraging is not just financial. It is emotional, social, and psychological. Too many commitments, too many expectations, too many dependencies. When everything demands attention, nothing receives enough. Men who simplified their lives reduced leverage across all domains. They cut back on social obligations. They limited financial entanglements. They reduced emotional exposure. This created margin. Margin absorbs shock. Without margin, even small disruptions feel catastrophic. The absence of margin explains much of the panic visible now. People are operating at capacity with no buffer. Any unexpected expense, any emotional setback, any structural change pushes them toward crisis. In that state, rational conversation becomes difficult. Survival mode narrows perspective. Survival mode also changes how people interpret fairness. Fairness becomes personal rather than structural. People ask why others appear less stressed. They ask why relief is uneven. They ask why systems seem indifferent. These questions are understandable, but they often overlook how different paths produce different outcomes. One of the most uncomfortable realizations for many is that independence is not a static achievement. It is an ongoing process. It requires constant adjustment, risk management, and self regulation. It is not guaranteed by ideology, it is earned through behavior. When independence was framed as liberation without responsibility, people embraced it enthusiastically. When responsibility arrives later, it feels like betrayal. But responsibility was always part of the equation. It was simply delayed by favorable conditions. The delay created complacency. Complacency allowed unrealistic expectations to harden into identity. Now, as reality intrudes, those identities feel threatened. Threatened identities respond defensively. Defense often takes the form of demands rather than adaptation. This is why we see calls for expanded benefits without corresponding responsibility. It is why people attempt to stretch definitions rather than reevaluate choices. It is easier to demand inclusion than to admit miscalculation. Men who walked away avoided this trap by detaching identity from external validation. Their sense of worth became internal rather than negotiated. This internal anchoring made them less reactive. Less reactive people are harder to manipulate. Manipulation relies on emotional hooks: guilt, shame, fear, and approval. When those hooks lose effectiveness, influence declines. This is why messaging that once worked no longer resonates with disengaged individuals. At the same time, those still deeply invested in external validation feel the loss of influence acutely. When social pressure fails, frustration escalates. Attempts to regain control become more aggressive. That aggression further alienates those who left. This feedback loop accelerates division. Each side interprets the other through its own lens. One sees selfishness, the other sees self preservation. Without shared assumptions, dialogue breaks down. Another factor intensifying this divide is how openly financial stress is now discussed. Money was once a private concern. Now it is a public performance. Videos about struggling to pay bills, afford housing, or maintain lifestyles circulate widely. These expressions normalize stress, but also amplify it. Constant exposure to others' struggles creates a sense of collective crisis. Crisis language heightens emotion. Heightened emotion reduces nuance. Everything becomes urgent. Urgency discourages patience. Patience, however, is exactly what adaptation requires. Systems do not change overnight. Trust does not rebuild instantly. Habits do not reverse on command. Demanding immediate relief from long term misalignment is unrealistic. Men who adjusted earlier understood this implicitly. They made gradual changes over time. They did not wait for permission. They accepted short term discomfort for long term stability. That trade off is now visible in outcomes. This does not mean their path is easy or flawless. It means it is aligned with reality. Alignment reduces friction. Reduced friction feels like peace, and peace is not flashy. It does not generate applause, but it sustains. As pressure increases, more people will face a choice: continue demanding systems bend to expectation, or adjust expectations to fit systems. Historically, the latter produces better outcomes. Adjustment requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some ideas did not account for stress. It requires letting go of narratives that promised more than they could deliver. Humility is difficult in a culture that equates confidence with certainty. Admitting uncertainty feels like weakness, but uncertainty acknowledged early prevents crisis later. Another shift becoming visible is how people view relationships. Relationships are increasingly evaluated through a cost benefit lens. Emotional connection is still valued, but stability matters more. People are less willing to enter arrangements that introduce risk without clear reward. This pragmatism is often criticized as cold or transactional. In reality, it is adaptive. Under pressure, idealism gives way to practicality. That does not eliminate emotion, it contextualizes it. Men who walked away applied this pragmatism early. They asked whether the emotional and financial costs of traditional arrangements matched the benefits. For many, the answer was no. That calculation guided their decisions. Now, as conditions worsen, others are forced to make similar calculations under duress. Making decisions under duress is harder than making them calmly. It leads to resentment toward those who acted earlier. Resentment, however, does not create leverage, it creates distance. Distance reinforces withdrawal. The irony is that cooperation becomes more valuable as resources tighten, yet more difficult to achieve. Cooperation requires trust. Trust requires fairness. Fairness requires accountability. Accountability means acknowledging how actions contributed to current conditions. That acknowledgement must be mutual. One sided accountability breeds further resentment. Men who disengaged often feel they were held accountable disproportionately. They were expected to absorb risk, provide stability, and tolerate instability. When they withdrew, they reclaimed agency. If cooperation is to return, agency must be respected on all sides. Participation must be optional, not assumed. Obligation must be reciprocal, not one directional. This is the crux of the issue. Systems built on assumed obligation fail when people assert choice. Choice changes dynamics, it forces renegotiation. Renegotiation is uncomfortable because it exposes imbalances that were previously hidden. Those benefiting from imbalance resist change. Those harmed by it demand reform. Conflict arises. The resolution of that conflict determines whether systems evolve or fracture. Evolution requires compromise. Fracture occurs when compromise is refused. At present, compromise is rare because narratives remain polarized. Each side frames itself as victim and the other as villain. That framing simplifies reality but prevents solutions. Solutions require complexity. They require acknowledging that multiple truths can coexist. Independence can be empowering and isolating. Cooperation can be stabilizing and restrictive. Neither is absolute. The future will likely involve hybrid arrangements, flexible partnerships, modular communities, systems that allow entry and exit without catastrophic loss. These designs acknowledge human variability. Rigid systems fail when humans refuse to conform. Flexible systems survive because they adapt to behavior rather than demanding obedience. Men walking away exposed rigidity. It showed where systems relied on silent compliance. Now that compliance is optional, redesign is inevitable. The question is whether redesign will be proactive or reactive. Proactive redesign anticipates behavior and aligns incentives. Reactive redesign lags behind crisis and often overcorrects. Overcorrection introduces new problems. History is full of examples where attempts to force outcomes created unintended consequences. Those consequences often worsen the original issue. Calm, deliberate change avoids this. It requires slowing down narratives, reducing emotional charge, and focusing on mechanics rather than morality. Mechanics do not care who is right, they care what works. What works is balance balance between autonomy and responsibility, balance between independence and support, balance between expectation and capacity. Men who simplified their lives achieve balance by reducing external demands. Others will need to find balance through different means. There is no single solution. What is essential is abandoning the illusion that balance can be achieved without trade offs. Every path has costs. Choosing consciously is better than drifting blindly. As we move closer to the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that the current turbulence is not an endpoint, it is a transition. Transitions are chaotic by nature. Old patterns break before new ones stabilize. Those who navigate transitions best are those who remain observant, flexible, and grounded. They resist panic, they avoid extremes, they adjust incrementally. The loudest voices rarely lead transitions successfully. They generate heat, not light. Quiet adaptation often shapes outcomes more effectively. Men walking away was a quiet adaptation. Its effects are now visible. Others will adapt in their own ways. The cumulative result will reshape social norms over time. Whether that reshaping leads to stability or fragmentation depends on how honestly society responds to signals. Denial prolongs pain, acknowledgement shortens it. Acknowledgement does not require agreement on everything. It requires recognizing patterns and adjusting behavior accordingly. That is how systems survive stress. The story unfolding now is not about blame, it is about alignment, it is about learning which structures hold under pressure and which collapse. The people who thrive will be those who align their lives with reality rather than ideology. They will prioritize stability over performance. They will value peace over approval. And that shift, once it reaches critical mass, will redefine success again. Not as accumulation, not as visibility, but as resilience. As this transition deepens, another reality becomes unavoidable. Many people were never taught how to build a life that could withstand pressure without external support. They were taught how to aspire, how to perform, how to demand recognition, but not how to create internal stability. When external systems begin to wobble, that lack of internal structure becomes painfully obvious. Stability is not a personality trait, it is a skill set. It involves budgeting, emotional regulation, long term planning, boundary setting, and realistic expectations. These skills are quiet. They are not celebrated in viral clips or motivational speeches, but they are what determine whether someone feels grounded or overwhelmed when conditions change. Men who walked away were forced to develop these skills because they removed external buffers. Without someone else absorbing shock, they had to manage it themselves. That necessity accelerated maturity. It forced clarity. It rewarded discipline. Over time, those habits compounded into resilience. By contrast, many people who relied on external validation or shared burden delayed developing those skills. As long as support existed, the gap was invisible. Now, as pressure mounts, the gap widens quickly. This disparity explains why some people appear calm while others appear frantic under similar conditions. It is not about fairness, it is about preparation. Preparation is often invisible until it is tested. The current environment is a test. It is testing financial assumptions, emotional assumptions, and social assumptions. It is revealing which beliefs were grounded in reality and which were propped up by comfort. Tests do not care about intent, they only measure outcomes. One of the most uncomfortable outcomes is the realization that independence is not empowerment by default. Empowerment comes from competence, not labels. Without competence, independence becomes exposure. Exposure under pressure feels like abandonment. This is why some narratives have shifted from celebration to complaint. What once felt like freedom now feels like vulnerability. What once felt empowering now feels exhausting. That shift is jarring because it contradicts years of messaging. When messaging collapses, people experience cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance creates anxiety. Anxiety demands resolution. Resolution is sought through external change rather than internal adjustment because internal adjustment requires humility. Humility is in short supply during periods of identity stress. Men who withdrew avoided identity stress by decoupling identity from external roles. They stopped defining themselves by relationship status, approval, or performance. That decoupling insulated them emotionally. Without identity tied to outcomes, failure lost its sting. This decoupling is one of the most powerful but least discussed aspects of disengagement. When people no longer need external confirmation to feel complete, they become harder to control. They are less reactive. Less reactive individuals move slowly and deliberately. That frustrates systems accustomed to urgency. Urgency is a tool of pressure. It forces decisions without reflection. When urgency fails to produce compliance, it often escalates into panic. We see that escalation now. Panic masquerades as activism, outrage, or moral urgency, but beneath it is fear. Fear of instability, fear of irrelevance, fear of having been wrong. Fear is understandable, but it is not a strategy. Strategies require clarity. They require acknowledging constraints. They require trade offs. Fear resists trade offs because it wants relief without cost. Relief without cost is a fantasy. Every solution extracts payment somewhere. The only question is who pays and when. Men who simplified their lives chose to pay earlier. They paid with solitude, reduced social validation, and limited options. In exchange, they gained peace and predictability. Others delayed payment, enjoying comfort while conditions allowed. Now the bill is arriving. Delayed bills always feel unfair. But delay does not erase obligation, it only compounds it. This is why the conversation feels harsher now. It is not that people became less compassionate, it is that reality became less forgiving. Forgiveness is easier when resources are abundant. Scarcity reveals priorities. Under scarcity, systems favor behaviors that reduce long term strain. They reward planning, restraint, and cooperation. They penalize excess, impulsivity, and overextension. This is not moral judgment, it is mechanics. Those mechanics apply to relationships as much as economics. Relationships that increase stability endure. Relationships that increase volatility dissolve. Over time, patterns become visible. Men who walked away recognized volatility early. They recognized that emotional unpredictability, legal exposure, and financial obligation created asymmetrical risk. They chose to exit rather than absorb that risk indefinitely. Now, as volatility increases across society, others are feeling similar impulses. They may not withdraw completely, but they are becoming more cautious. They delay commitment, they reduce exposure, they demand clarity. This caution is often misinterpreted as coldness. In reality, it is risk management. Risk management becomes essential when safety nets weaken. The weakening of safety nets is another underreported factor. Many assumed institutional support would expand indefinitely. Instead, it is strained. Budgets tighten. Eligibility narrows. Bureaucracy slows. Expectations exceed capacity. When institutions cannot meet expectations, individuals feel abandoned. That abandonment fuels resentment toward those perceived as more insulated. Insulation becomes a source of envy. Envy, like resentment, distorts perception. It attributes outcomes to unfair advantage rather than behavior. This distortion prevents learning. Learning would require acknowledging that different choices produce different results. Acknowledging that truth threatens narratives built on equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. When outcomes diverge significantly, pressure mounts to equalize results artificially. Artificial equalization introduces new problems. History shows that attempts to equalize outcomes without addressing behavior create dependency and resentment simultaneously. Those forced to subsidize feel exploited. Those receiving support feel infantilized. Trust erodes on both sides. Sustainable systems avoid this trap by aligning incentives. They encourage behaviors that strengthen the system and discourage those that weaken it. Alignment is more effective than enforcement. Men walking away disrupted alignment by opting out. That disruption exposed where systems relied on unacknowledged labor and tolerance. Once exposed, redesign becomes necessary. Redesign requires admitting that old assumptions no longer hold. It requires questioning whether incentives match desired outcomes. It requires humility from institutions and individuals alike. Humility is difficult in a culture that equates certainty with strength, but rigidity breaks under pressure. Flexibility bends and survives. Those who survive transitions are rarely the loudest. They are the ones quietly adjusting while others argue. They conserve energy, they observe, they act when necessary. This pattern is repeating now. While debates rage online, many individuals are making private decisions. They are changing spending habits. They are redefining relationships. They are relocating. They are simplifying. These micro decisions aggregate into macro change. By the time institutions react, the ground has already shifted. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is how people talk about the future. Optimism has become cautious. Long term plans are tentative. Flexibility is valued more than certainty. This caution is rational. It reflects awareness of volatility. Those who insist on rigid plans often experience the most stress when conditions change. Men who walked away embraced uncertainty by reducing dependency. With fewer obligations, uncertainty became manageable. With fewer liabilities, adaptation became easier. Adaptation is the skill that matters most now, not ideology, not identity. Adaptation. Adaptation requires letting go of expectations that no longer serve reality. It requires updating beliefs based on evidence. It requires resisting emotional narratives that promise comfort without foundation. This is why observable behavior matters more than words. People say many things when conditions are easy. Behavior under pressure reveals true priorities. Under pressure, many men prioritize peace over participation. That choice is now shaping the social landscape. The question society faces is not whether that choice was right or wrong, it is whether systems can adapt to it. Adaptation may involve redefining partnerships, it may involve new economic models, it may involve cultural shifts that value restraint over excess. What it cannot involve is pretending the shift did not happen, pretending prolongs instability. Acceptance enables adjustment. Adjustment does not mean capitulation, it means realism. It means acknowledging that human behavior responds to incentives, not ideals. Ideals inspire, incentives sustain. The ideals of independence inspired many. The incentives of independence are now being tested. Some find the trade acceptable, others do not. There is no universal answer, but there is a universal lesson. Choices have costs. Denying costs delays reckoning. As we approach the final phase of this discussion, the emphasis shifts toward resolution. Not resolution in the sense of agreement, but resolution in the sense of clarity. Clarity about what works, clarity about what does not, clarity about trade offs. Clarity reduces anxiety because it replaces confusion with understanding. Understanding allows deliberate choice. Men who walked away made deliberate choices. Others now face the opportunity to do the same. The future will be shaped by those who choose consciously rather than react emotionally. Those who accept trade offs rather than demand exceptions. Those who build stability internally rather than expect it externally. This transition is painful, but it is also corrective. It strips away illusions and forces alignment. Alignment, once achieved, brings peace. Peace is not loud, it does not argue, it simply exists. And as more people seek peace rather than validation, the social landscape will continue to change. Whether institutions are ready or not, at some point, every society reaches a moment where it must choose between illusion and adjustment. Illusions are comforting. They tell people that nothing needs to change, that outcomes can be preserved without cost. And that discomfort is temporary. Adjustment is harder. It requires people to accept that the world has changed and that previous assumptions no longer apply. What we are witnessing now is that moment playing out in real time. The tension we see is not the result of one group failing or another group winning. It is the result of systems colliding with reality. When expectations were built during a period of relative stability, they carried hidden assumptions about endless growth, shared burden, and automatic support. Those assumptions are now being tested by rising costs, strained institutions, and changing behavior. Tests reveal weaknesses. They do not care about intentions. The men who walked away did not cause this pressure. They responded to it early. They sensed instability, asymmetry, and risk, and they chose to reduce exposure rather than argue endlessly about fairness. That decision was not dramatic, it was quiet. And quiet decisions are often the most consequential because they are not debated until their effects become visible. Visibility changes everything. Once people see that an alternative way of living is possible, the idea that there is only one acceptable path collapses. Choice expands. And when choice expands, leverage shifts. Systems that relied on obligation must now compete with alternatives that offer peace, simplicity, and control. That competition is uncomfortable because it exposes what was previously taken for granted. Time, attention, and resources were once assumed to be available on demand. Now they are negotiated, guarded, or withheld entirely. This shift forces a reevaluation of value. What is worth effort? What is worth risk? What is worth commitment? These questions are not cynical, they are necessary. They arise whenever conditions change faster than norms can keep up. Pretending they are immoral or selfish does not make them disappear. It only drives them underground where they shape behavior quietly. One of the most important realizations to emerge from this moment is that peace is not something society hands out. Peace is constructed individually through boundaries, restraint, and realistic expectations. It is built by aligning life with what can be sustained rather than what looks impressive. Men who walked away learned this through experience. They learned that reducing complexity reduced stress. They learned that fewer obligations meant greater flexibility. They learned that approval is optional and often expensive. These lessons are not exclusive. Anyone can apply them, but applying them requires letting go of narratives that promise reward without cost. Letting go is uncomfortable. It feels like loss even when it leads to stability. Many people resist letting go because they invested years into certain beliefs. Admitting those beliefs were incomplete feels like admitting failure. But growth is not failure, it is correction. Corrections are painful because they interrupt momentum, but momentum toward instability is not progress, it is acceleration toward collapse. Slowing down to correct course is not weakness, it is wisdom. The desperation we see in public conversations is a signal that correction is overdue. When people begin searching for relief through symbolic actions and legal stretching, it indicates that reality no longer matches expectations. Ignoring that signal would be a mistake. The attempt to redefine dependence is not the heart of the issue, it is a symptom. The heart of the issue is that many people feel unsupported while carrying full responsibility alone. That feeling deserves examination. But examination must be honest. It must include acknowledging how choices, incentives, and systems interact. Support does not exist in isolation. It is funded, structured, and justified by outcomes. When outcomes change, support structures follow. This is not cruelty, it is sustainability. Sustainable systems depend on aligned incentives. They encourage behaviors that reduce long term strain. They discourage behaviors that increase volatility. When incentives and behavior diverge, systems strain until something gives. What is giving now is not society itself, but outdated assumptions about how society functions. The idea that participation can be demanded without reciprocity. The idea that Stability can be outsourced indefinitely. The idea that independence has no maintenance cost. These ideas are being corrected by reality. Correction does not mean returning to the past. It means building forward with clearer understanding. The future will not look like the past, but it will still obey fundamental principles. Shared responsibility requires trust. Trust requires fairness. Fairness requires accountability. Accountability requires honesty. Honesty begins with recognizing that people respond to incentives more than slogans. If engagement is risky and unrewarding, people disengage. If peace is accessible through withdrawal, people withdraw. This is not rebellion, it is adaptation. Adaptation is not a threat, it is how societies survive change. The real threat is refusing to adapt while expecting behavior to revert magically. That expectation is unrealistic. The men who walked away are not waiting to be convinced. They are not angry. They are not plotting. They are simply living differently. And that difference is now part of the social landscape, whether anyone likes it or not. If society wants cooperation to return in new forms, it must make cooperation rational again. That means reducing asymmetrical risk. That means valuing contribution. That means respecting choice rather than punishing it. Cooperation built on respect lasts longer than cooperation built on pressure. Pressure creates compliance at best and resentment at worst. Compliance fades when alternatives exist. Resentment accelerates withdrawal. Respect, by contrast, invites participation without force. This is the crossroads we are at now. One path leads toward escalating demands, moral framing, and increasing withdrawal. The other leads toward recalibration, realism, and redesigned incentives. Neither path is easy, but only one is sustainable. Sustainability requires people to take responsibility for what they can control: finances, expectations, boundaries, skills, emotional regulation. These are not glamorous topics, but they are the foundation of resilience. Resilience is what determines who thrives during transition, not outrage, not visibility, not rhetoric, resilience. The men who simplified their lives did not become resilient overnight. They built it quietly through discipline and restraint. That process is available to anyone willing to accept trade offs. Trade offs are unavoidable. The question is whether they are chosen consciously or imposed later under pressure. Conscious trade offs preserve dignity. Imposed trade offs breed resentment. This moment offers a chance to choose consciously, to reevaluate priorities, to decide what kind of life is worth building under new conditions, to accept that stability looks different now than it did before. The noise will continue. There will be more arguments, more headlines, more symbolic gestures. But beneath that noise, the direction is already set by behavior. People are simplifying. People are withdrawing. People are prioritizing peace. Peace is not selfish, it is necessary. Without peace, nothing else functions well. Without peace, cooperation fails. Without peace, creativity dies. As more people recognize this, the cultural emphasis will shift. Less emphasis on performance, more emphasis on sustainability, less emphasis on approval, more emphasis on autonomy, less emphasis on demands, more emphasis on boundaries. This shift will not be celebrated loudly. It will happen quietly through individual choices. Those choices will aggregate into new norms over time. Norms always lag behavior. By the time norms change, behavior has already moved on. That is why debates feel out of sync. They are arguing about a world that is already fading. The future will belong to those who understand this lag and act accordingly. Those who stop waiting for permission. Those who stop expecting validation. Those who build lives that can withstand pressure without constant reinforcement. And this is not the end of society, it is a rebalancing. Rebalancing is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. It clears excess. It exposes weakness. It creates space for stability to return in new forms. As we close this discussion, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree? Do you see these patterns around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation is far bigger than any one perspective. And as always, like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.